très chaleureusement par quelques mots en français avant de donner la parole à notre invité. Ceci est la conférence de clôture des rencontres de Genève, Histoire et Cité, qui ont été organisées par l'Université de Genève en collaboration avec plusieurs partenaires dont nous sommes, à laquelle nous sommes heureux d'être associés. Et cette conférence de clôture nous est donnée par une historienne de grand renom que beaucoup d'entre nous connaissent à travers ses livres ou à travers ses conférences. Margaret Macmillan est actuellement la directrice de St. Anthony's College à Oxford, après avoir passé un certain nombre d'années à l'Université de Toronto. Elle est très connue pour ses livres d'histoire qui portent pour partie sur l'histoire britannique, l'histoire de l'Empire britannique, et pour partie sur la Première Guerre mondiale. Ces deux livres les plus connus du grand public portent respectivement sur la paix qui a conclu la Première Guerre mondiale, la paix de Paris, la conférence de Paris, et l'autre sur les origines de la Première Guerre mondiale. Et c'est de ce sujet qu'elle va nous parler d'une manière qui nous permettra de mettre un terme en beauté à ces rencontres de Genève, Histoire et Cité. Merci.
Well, thank you so much, Director, for that very kind introduction. It is a great pleasure to be here, and thank you for arranging such a beautiful day as well, by comparison with yesterday. To try and explain the outbreak of the First World War, I should tell you, is probably impossible. It has been estimated that in English alone, there are some 30,000 works on the origins of the war. It is an argument and a discussion which started almost as soon as the guns started firing in 1914, as governments on the different sides rummaged through their files and tried to show that they were not responsible for what was becoming apparent was a complete catastrophe for European society, and that the other side was. And those debates, some of them sponsored by governments, many of them among private citizens, many of them, of course, among historians, have gone on ever since. With the anniversary of the war in 2014 and in the years that are now following, the books continue to come out. Mine was only one among many that came out, and there is no consensus among us. I've been on a number of panels with historians whom I respect a great deal, and I cannot find that we are going to agree on anything. There are those who would blame France, those who blame Russia, those who blame Germany, those who blame individuals such as Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany, or Admiral Tirpitz of Germany, or the Chief of the General Staff of Austria-Hungary, General Konrad von Hotzendorf. About the only country so far that hasn't been blamed is my own country, Canada. But I'm working on this. I think Canada ought to have a role in this great debate more than it actually does. I think it is so difficult to try and explain the origins of the First World War because we're looking at many possible causes. I think we're also looking at an event that was so momentous in its impact and consequences for European society and indeed for the world as a whole that we want to find an explanation. I think we're driven to keep on trying to understand the causes of the First World War, both by the complexity of the possible causes, but also by the feeling, a feeling which I think has been with us for 100 years now, that something so dreadful must have an explanation, that we can't live in a world in which something like the First World War cannot be explained. But when you try and find the causes of the causes of the First World War, I think you're looking at everything from individuals, and I think individual decisions, in fact, do at various points make a difference, but you're also looking at the world in which those decisions were made. You're looking at the values of that world, you're looking at the assumptions of that world, you're looking at the tensions in that world, and so you have to take into account such things as national rivalries, economic rivalries, competition for colonies. You have to, I think, look at the arms race, which was becoming increasingly expensive and increasingly important in Europe in the years just before 1914. You have to look at the military plans. And I sometimes feel as if what you're doing when you're trying to understand the First World War is trying to understand a chess game, which is played on 3 different boards at least, all of them connected, so that moving a pawn or a queen or a castle on one board affects something on the other 2 boards. The best explanation I've come up with, which is not, as you will see, a very satisfactory one, is that what happened in 1914 was very much like a perfect storm, that a number of things came together in a particular sequence, which made what might have been yet another crisis in the Balkans, because there had been several crises in the Balkans before 1914, but a number of things came together to make what happened in 1914 uncontrollable. And once Europe had got into the war, it became very, very difficult to stop it. The war turned out to be much longer than most people who had been making decisions and most people who had been watching those decisions could ever have expected. There had been some warnings that a future major European war would, in fact, very likely turn into a stalemate. There was a massive book written by a very important Russian financier and industrialist called Ivan Bloch, 6-volume history on the future of war, and he devoted, in fact, the rest of his life after he'd written the book to lecturing on it, writing short articles on it, trying, with, I think, an increasing sense of desperation, to awaken Europeans to the potential catastrophe that was looming. And what Ivan Bloch argued, and of course he wasn't right on anything, but I think he got it right in essence, what he argued was that European industry was now so successful that its very success would make it possible for the Europeans to keep very large armies in the field, that the old limits on the size of armies, the difficulties of moving them before railways, before modern transportation, the impossibility of feeding them after a certain length of time. I mean, in the Napoleonic Wars, armies were like locusts. They basically ate out everything in their surroundings, and then they usually had to move on simply because it was impossible to keep resupplying them. What the great success of European industry and the European economic strength generally meant was that it was possible now to put very large armies on the battlefields and keep them there indefinitely, keep them resupplied, keep on bringing up the equipment they needed, because Europe's factories were now capable of doing this and Europe's transportation system was capable of doing this, and keep on supplying them with the men, with the manpower that they needed. What he also pointed out was that the 2 sides, as they were emerging before 1914, and these were not, I think, tight alliance systems, but you could see the outlines of the protagonists. On the one side, Germany, Austria-Hungary, and then in the end, the Ottoman Empire and smaller allies like Bulgaria. And Italy was always a question mark. In the end, didn't come in on the side of Germany and Austria-Hungary. And then on the other side, France and Russia, who did have a defensive military alliance, and Britain, which had chosen to at least align itself with them, although there was no tight alliance between Britain and either France or Russia. And so these 2 great groupings, he argued, were so evenly balanced in terms of population, in terms of resources, that once they got into a conflict, it was very likely that neither would be strong enough to win, but both would be strong enough to stave off defeat. And he also pointed out what had happened to military technology, that just partly simply by sheer accident, which is what happens so often in history, the power to defend by the decade before 1914 was much stronger than the power to attack. It was easier to get a well-defended position, easier to man that position because of the nature of the weaponry. It was now much, much more difficult to attack because you were attacking across a much greater field of fire. Whereas in the Napoleonic Wars, you had to worry about someone shooting you from 100 yards away. By the time of the First World War, you had to worry about someone shooting you with accuracy, with much more deadly weapons from at least 1,000 yards away, say at least 100 meters away. And so it was becoming increasingly difficult to attack, and the losses of those who were attacking were mounting. He pointed all this out, and he tended to be dismissed. He was dismissed by the military planners, who thought that they could still win wars. It, I think, was the nature of their training, that they were there to solve problems, not to throw up their hands and say nothing can be done. And he was dismissed because he was a banker and a civilian, and what did he know about war? And so all these things have to be taken into account, that there were warnings, there were those who foresaw what it might be like, but there were the sorts of tensions and the sorts of decisions that were going to lead Europe into war. Having said that, I think what we always need to keep in mind is that it was not inevitable, it was not foreordained, at least in my view, that Europe was going to have a catastrophic war in 1914. It could have had one in 1912, it could have had one in 1911, it could have had one in 1913. All those occasions there was talk of a general European war and it didn't happen. If Europe had managed somehow to survive through until 1915, the international scene might have looked very different. The British were very concerned about their relations with Russia. They were not at all sure that they would be able to keep on friendly terms with them. There was real tension along the borders between Central Asia and Russia, and the British were very, very concerned about Russia moving down into the north of what was then called Persia, which is today Iran, and it is quite possible that Britain and Russia would have fallen out. It was also always possible that Britain and Germany would have mended fences. There were those in both countries, and indeed those who observed from outside, who said really the natural alliance in Europe, or one of the most natural alliances, was between Britain and Germany. Germany had the biggest land army in Europe, Britain had the biggest navy in the world. Both shared values, both were predominantly Protestant countries, linked by family. You know that right from the royal families on downwards, there were many family links between Britain and Germany. When the British cabinet was sitting in the summer of 1914 trying to decide whether or not to go to war against Germany, 4 members of that cabinet had been educated at German universities. And that was not unusual. A number of Germans had been educated in British universities. So there were very tight links. They also were each other's largest trading partners. And so economically, it made sense for them not to go to war with each other, but far from it, it made economic sense for them to continue to be friends with each other. And there had been talks right up until 1914 between British and German representatives about how they might overcome their past differences and come to some new sort of understanding. And the British were prepared to go a long way to concede what was one of Germany's major demands, and that was that Germany should have an empire. The British, with the ruthlessness which great powers usually display, were quite prepared to hand over to Germany the African colonies of their oldest ally, Portugal. The British were quite prepared to hand over Angola and Mozambique to Germany. The Portuguese, of course, were not consulted on this. And so it is quite possible that by 1915 the international scene might have looked very different. Quite possible that some of the tensions that were affecting that international scene might have been replaced by relative peace. They could always, of course, have been replaced by other tensions. But I think important to remember that what we tend to think of as fixed alliances before the First World War were nothing of the sort. They were much more loose, much more porous, much more capable of change. And if you want only one example of that, of course, it's the example of Italy, which I mentioned earlier. Italy was linked in what was called the Triple Alliance with Russia and with Austria-Hungary and with Germany. But these were defensive alliances, and the countries involved were only bound to get involved if their alliance partner was attacked by a third party. And you know, it's always possible to get out of alliances. You can always almost find a loophole. And if you don't live up to the terms of your alliance, what is the sanction? What is the international body that is going to fine you and punish you in some way? It doesn't exist. And so Italy, when the war broke out, found reason not to get involved in that war. It argued that Austria-Hungary had not been attacked, Germany had not been attacked, that they had attacked first. It may have been semantic. I think the Germans certainly felt it. But I think it shows that the alliance systems were much looser than we might imagine. So what I think is important then, and I want to stress this, is that we look back, and the danger of looking back is we see all the things that produced the result we know happened. We look back before 1914 and we can see step by step, we think very clearly, as if these steps are very firmly linked, Europe marching towards war. But what I think is important to remember is Europeans themselves didn't feel it. They did think they had choices. They did, many of them, think that peace was something that was going to continue. And I think we need to look at that and try and understand why Europeans might have felt like this. And I think we try and need to tell ourselves that war needn't have been inevitable. There were choices. There were very strong forces, it must be admitted, tending towards war in Europe. But there were very strong forces as well tending towards peace. And we tend to forget those because it's not peace that came, it's war that came. But let me just say something very briefly about those forces which were tending for peace. Partly, Europe had reached a point where it was now so economically linked by trade, linked by communications, linked by investment, linked also by movements of peoples. And peoples were moving across Europe, working in different countries. Trade and investment was linking European countries together. Shortly before the First World War broke out, one of the largest German industrialists had just bought a large amount of land in England where he was planning to build a very large factory. And this was not unusual. So for a lot of Europeans, the very linking of Europe, particularly I think in the economic sense, meant that war was not something that made any rational sense. And a very popular book written by a journalist, Norman Angell, a British journalist before 1914, had enormous success saying exactly this. The book was called The Great Illusion. And he said it is a great illusion that these days, in the modern world, given the nature of modern economies and the way in which we're all linked together, it is a great illusion that war can pay. It doesn't. It's not like the Middle Ages, where you could march over your borders into the territory of your neighbor and you could ransack his castle and take away his gold and silver plate and possibly his wife, and you would actually gain something from it. It's not going to be like that anymore. And one of the examples he gave, I think, is very interesting. He said, look, if Germany wants the benefits of the Belgian economy, if Germany wants all the things that those productive Belgian farms and productive Belgian factories can produce, it's much better off buying them and encouraging the Belgians to produce more. Because if Germany invades Belgium, it will have the expense of occupying it. It will have to deal with a resentful population which will not want to produce for Germany. It will, in fact, find that it has hurt itself economically by trying to invade another country and take over its economy. Germany, and this was true of all European nations, are much further ahead, said Angell, when they trade with each other. And you also had those who argued that war would become impossible in the modern world after about 6 weeks because all international financing would dry up. And since so much of what was happening in Europe depended on loans from other countries, it was assumed that they would simply be unable to afford to pay for the war when they could no longer borrow on the international market. And so I think a lot of Europeans were very struck by these arguments. And Angell's book went through many editions, was wildly popular. Students at university, even in some cases, studied something called Angelism, which was not the theological thing you might think, but was studying the work of Norman Angell. And so for a lot of Europeans, the idea really had begun to sink in that war was not something that was profitable or sensible. More than that, I think, for a lot of Europeans, war had become something that was just so unlikely. They hadn't, most of them, experienced it directly. It was a memory of their grandparents. But for most Europeans, war had not been something they encountered directly. And I think Europeans can be forgiven. They may have been blind, but they can be forgiven for assuming that war was something that they just didn't do any longer. That war was something that happened elsewhere. That war was something that people in Asia or Africa or the Middle East or somewhere like uncivilized like the United States might do. But war was not something that you did in an increasingly civilized and prosperous and interconnected Europe. And I think that is important. It doesn't mean they were working actively for peace, but what it does mean is they were beginning to assume that there were other ways of dealing with international issues, other ways of dealing with disputes among nations than going to war. When Europeans look back at their own century, the 19th century, they could see this for themselves. I mean, there had been wars, it has to be admitted, in Europe, but they had for the most part been between only two protagonists, only two people, only two countries. And for the most part, they had been very short. Most of the major European wars between 1815, when the Napoleonic Wars ended, and 1914 were over in 6 weeks. And they were decisive. In 1870, the German Confederation defeated France at the Battle of Sedan. It was a decisive victory. It took a bit longer to make peace, but Europeans looked back at that war and they said, well, it settled something. France didn't get much out of it. It lost 2 provinces, but it did leave some clear conclusion. And so I think a lot of Europeans simply thought the whole pattern was demonstrating that war wasn't likely to happen anytime soon. And I do think that's something important to remember. More than that, I think, a lot of Europeans thought that they had become more civilized than war. There was a great faith among a lot of people in the 19th century, and there was always questioned, of course, but there was a great faith that Europe was making progress, that Europe was making progress not just economically, and that is something people could see in their own lifetimes. Between 1815 and 1914, and even more after 1848, Europe's economic development was extraordinary by any standards. Europeans were living longer, they were eating better, they had access to more consumer goods, medicine was much better, cities were cleaner, and Europeans could see around them evidence that progress was taking place. And what they tended to assume was that this was not just economic progress, not just social progress, but it was political progress as well. More and more people were getting the vote. Even in countries like Russia, which was always seen as the most backward of the great powers, the Russian Tsar had been forced to concede a constitution after the Russo-Japanese War of 1904-1905. And at the local level, Russians were getting used to a modest amount of self-government, beginning to get experience in how to run their own affairs. Literacy was increasing, which meant people were more able to take part in the great debates that were affecting their societies. In 1914, the biggest single newspaper in Moscow had a circulation, a daily circulation of 800,000, which gives you some sense of the ways in which Europe was changing and some sense of the ways in which you were getting a much better educated public, which was now more willing and able to participate in the political life of its own country. And so Europeans felt that progress was not just something that could be measured economically, it was something that could be measured civilizationally, that European civilization was now advanced and was continuing to advance. I mean, there were always those who said we should be careful, but I think there was generally a faith that things were going to get better. As they looked into the 20th century, they thought this is going to be a very good century for Europe, even better than the 19th century. Some of you may have read the great Austrian writer Stefan Zweig, who wrote a book called The World of Yesteryear. He wrote it in 1941 when he was in exile from Hitler's Germany, and he wrote back with, of course, the nostalgia you might expect about his own childhood before 1914, which he described as the golden age of security. He said he grew up in a prosperous Jewish middle-class family in Vienna at a time when Jews were becoming fully integrated into European society. He felt none of the discrimination or stigmatization that might have affected his grandparents. He felt completely integrated into Austrian society. He said his parents assumed that their property would remain safe. They assumed that the Austro-Hungarian monarchy would continue for another 1,000 years, just as it already had continued. All of that, of course, disappeared. He finished his memoirs, and he and his young wife committed suicide. He could no longer bear to see what had happened to that world which he had once thought so secure and so safe. But a lot of Europeans, I think, in 1914 did think that the 20th century would be a good century. And they looked also at the ways in which the whole new international order seemed to be emerging, ways of settling disputes which were moving beyond war, ways of establishing international norms. Increasingly, you had international organizations dedicated to trying to find new ways of dealing with international issues and settling international disputes. And so there were international organizations of jurists, for example, international organizations of liberal politicians. Increasingly, you've got people arguing that there must be mechanisms for settling disputes. And one of the mechanisms that a lot of people put a lot of faith in was arbitration. The idea that disputes between nations can be settled when both parties agree to submit their grievance, their differences, to a third party, and crucially agree to be bound by the decision of that third party. Now, there were some 300 international arbitrations held between 1794 and 1914. And more than half of those 300 arbitrations were held after 1890. And so I think Europeans, again, and others in the world can be forgiven for thinking they see a pattern developing here, that they really are moving beyond war as a means of settling disputes. Finally, I think, on the side of peace, you had very active peace organizations, not just middle-class organizations, although they were important. You had very powerful and rich men contributing a great deal of money to the cause of peace. Andrew Carnegie, the Scottish-American billionaire, built the Peace Palace in The Hague, which you can still see, dedicated to the cause of peace. Alfred Nobel, the Scandinavian explosives manufacturer, felt a certain guilt about what it was he'd developed. Explosives, of course, for mining, but also very useful for war, and so contributed a very large part of his considerable fortune to the cause of peace, including, of course, setting up the Nobel Peace Prize. But in addition to the middle-class peace movements, and in addition to the individuals, often very rich individuals, who were prepared to contribute to to the cause of peace, there was, of course, the extremely, well, at least potentially extremely important organization of the Second International. The Second International was the organization which brought together the left-wing and socialist parties of the world. And it was something that they themselves took very seriously, and so did the ruling elites. I mean, a number of people in different countries were very concerned about the Second International because it appeared to be a potentially very powerful force, and one that was likely to grow in power as the number of people belonging to unions in the world and as the number of people belonging to socialist parties and voting for those socialist parties. In 1912, in the German elections for the German Reichstag, the federal parliament of Germany, which was elected by universal manhood suffrage. Every male in Germany over a certain age had the right to vote in Reichstag elections. The socialists became the largest party in the Reichstag. A third of all Germans were voting for the German Socialist Party. And so the Second International, representing as it did socialist and left-wing parties from across Europe and from around the world, appeared to be a body that could only grow, was growing and could only grow more in power. It had an international bureau in Brussels. It had international congresses every 2 to 3 years. And a good deal of what they discussed, of course, was working conditions, how to improve conditions of the working classes, how to give them a greater say in politics and policies. But what they also discussed was how to stop war. And they discussed ways in which they might collectively prevent a general European war from breaking out. And they had in their hands, they thought, a very potent weapon. What they could do, many of them argued, and the French were particularly forceful in this. Jean Jaurès, the great French socialist, was very eloquent on this. They said what we can do is call a general strike. If a major European war breaks out, we, the workers, have nothing to gain from it. We're going to be filling up the big armies that are going to be assembled to march off to the frontiers. It's going to be us who get killed. We're going to be working in the factories to produce the equipment for war, but we're not going to be drawing on the profits of those factories. It's going to be the capitalist bosses who benefit. We will die in those wars, we will work for those wars, but it will not benefit us. And so we shouldn't have any part of it. What we should do is call a general strike. Now imagine what would have happened in 1914 if, as Jaurès was hoping, the Second International had called for a general strike. Those massive European armies, which relied on people coming back from the reserves, and these were armies which took young men of military age, trained them, and then sent them into the reserves, which meant they were still liable to come back. If those armies had not been capable of being mobilized, if the young men out in the reserves and middle-aged men out in the reserves had said, no, we're not coming, it would have meant those massive armies that went off and got themselves killed in such large numbers would not have been able to assemble. The French military authorities were in fact so worried about this that they assumed and they made plans for something like 20% of all the reserves in France not coming when they were called for, which is a very large proportion indeed. More than that, if there'd been a general strike, the trains wouldn't have run. So how would those massive armies have got up to the frontiers? The factories would have stopped working, the coal mines would have stopped working, and so the primary fuel on which Europe depended would not have been there. And so there were, I think, very real and serious talk about how peace might be maintained. And I think a general willingness, certainly among the socialist movement, but I think also in society at large, to believe that war was something that was not going to happen in Europe. That, of course, in a way was dangerous, because what it meant was when the crises came, a lot of people thought it can't happen, and perhaps they took it too much for granted that peace was something. Well, having said that, I do think we need to look at the forces for peace. Of course, what we also have to do is look at those forces which helped to produce the war of 1914, and helped, I think, to produce it both in material terms. I think we have to take into account the arms race, for example, but I think we also have to take into account the psychological preparation. There were forces within European society and ways of thinking within European society which made too many people, including, alas, many of those who were making the decisions, made too many people think that war was in fact something that was going to happen, whether they thought so in a spirit of resignation, or whether they thought so, as many of them did, in the spirit of thinking that war actually might be a good thing. That meant that when the crisis came in 1914, there were those who were prepared to contemplate war as something that they could fight, that they could win, which would actually bring benefits. And I think there are a number of things that contribute to this, and I'm sure you can all think of them yourselves, but let me just mention a few. One of the things I think that contributed to a sense among society that war, at least among certain people in European society, that war might be a good thing, was somehow an apprehension that Europe's very success was not good for European society. And this was a time of tremendous change, of tremendous technological and scientific innovation. And I think a lot of people found it was all going too fast. I mean, some of the worries are not unlike the ones I think we're facing today, where we worry about what's happening to human beings. Well, what does the computer revolution mean? I mean, are we all going to become part robot in the next 50 years? What's going to happen to us genetically? Is genetic modification going to tamper with what it means to be human? Are we going to get new forms of hybrid creatures emerging? I mean, these I think are worries that we're hearing increasingly, and I think you have something similar in Europe, and certainly in other parts of the world. But Europe, because it was so much the dominant and leading part of the world in 1914, these fears are expressed quite often there. Fears that society is moving too fast. There's a lot of talk about a disease called neurasthenia, where nerves get jangled and people can't calm down. They're always moving too fast. And when the Paris metro was opened, the two big concerns about the metro was that it wouldn't do people good to be whisked underground too quickly. The second fear, which was the one that actually still is with us, that there might be too many temptations for pickpockets. There was that. There was also a sense that the very success of European medicine was keeping people alive too long, and perhaps keeping people alive who shouldn't be kept alive, and that such people were reproducing themselves. This was the period in which you get a lot of talk about eugenics. The idea that you can somehow manipulate and breed the human species as you would manipulate and breed animals or plants in order to produce a better type of cow which produces more milk, or a better type of tomato which doesn't spoil when you pack it. And so you were beginning to get talk about how the human race maybe needed to be looked after a bit more carefully, that some people were living who shouldn't have lived, who in the old days might have died. They were then passing on their unhealthy characteristics to others. The first International Eugenics Congress was held in London in 1912, and this was not just some crackpot fringe organization. It took over the biggest concert hall in London, the Royal Albert Hall in the heart of London, and its honorary patrons included Winston Churchill, who was the First Lord of the Admiralty in the cabinet in charge of the British Navy, the president of Harvard University, and Alexander Graham Bell, I had to get a Canadian in here somewhere, who was the inventor of the telephone, among many other things. I mean, this was distressingly mainstream as we look back at it. There was also concern that people were not living in conditions that were likely to make them strong and robust and healthy. It was in this period you got a lot of worry about what cities were doing to people. And you got people saying you're much more healthy to live in the countryside. In England, there was a whole move to set up something called garden suburbs, where people would live in what was felt to be more healthy environments. There was a lot of worry that cities were making people weedy and nervous and not capable of fighting. This is when it really gets important, not capable of fighting and dying for their countries. And you get, in a number of European societies, very specific measures being taken to try and counteract what is seen as the degeneration of the particular human species that they were worried about. And it wasn't just eugenics. You get organizations being set up to try and give young people healthy outdoor lives. And the Boy Scouts in England is set up with this very much in mind. So are the Pfadfinders in Germany, which were modeled on the Boy Scouts. In France, they went in rather more for gymnastics with very natty uniforms, which people used to design for themselves. But the idea behind this was to make people physically more healthy, but more than that, it was to make them capable of fighting for their country and being prepared to sacrifice for their country. And so you get an unease in Europe, which I think reflects the very success that Europe has been experiencing, a feeling that it's somehow not good in the long run for Europe. What you also got, of course, is among the ruling elites, and particularly among the military, is a worry that they're not going to be able to get the right sort of men to be soldiers. And this is a concern. And you get a lot of alarmist things being written by the military saying we can't get good soldiers anymore, there's something badly wrong with society. Now, allied to this fear is, of course, a very potent emotion, and that's the emotion of nationalism. This is a period before 1914 of heightened and intense nationalism, where peoples increasingly define themselves in national terms. And this is a very new phenomenon for most of European society. People before the 19th century tended rather to define themselves in terms of who ruled over them, in terms of their village, in terms of their local community, in terms perhaps of their religion. but not so much in terms of this much larger abstraction called the nation. But thanks in part to modern communications and the spread of literacy and the spread of mass education, people increasingly are conceiving of themselves in the terms that Benedict Anderson used as imagined communities of nations. They're seeing themselves as part of this much larger unit. More than that, there is an increasing propensity to describe the nation as something that is somehow eternal, that the nation isn't something we've just all decided we rather like to be a part of. The nation is something that has existed for centuries. We haven't perhaps recognized that we're truly part of it, but it is something that is much bigger than us, that has preceded us, that will succeed us. It is a sort of entity that marches on down through time, drawing its members along with it. And what that sort of nationalism does, of course, is begin to divide people up. People begin to see themselves as possessing certain characteristics, usually, of course, very good and admirable characteristics. They begin to take pride in their own folk traditions. They begin, if you're a composer, you begin to look for folk music and begin to see if you can work this in to the music that you're composing as in some way reflecting the soul of your people. You begin to look, if you're an historian, at the history of your nation. And historians play a huge and I think largely regrettable role in this because they begin to create the national histories. They not only look for them, they create them. And they begin to portray this idea of the essential nation which exists somewhere. The origins are always somewhere in the mists of antiquity, which is a very convenient place to be if you don't want to prove anything. The origins are so far back we can't really prove it, but we know it was there. And they create these national, very powerful histories, which are based on clearly identified facts, which incorporate things that actually happened, but which are a large part of mythology as well. And so you get the great von Treitschke, Professor von Treitschke in Germany, arguing that the German nation has always been the most energetic and forceful nation in its part of the world. He argues that they were the only ones capable of standing up to the Romans. And what he assumes is nothing much has changed. Yes, the Germans are wearing slightly different clothes these days, but basically in their essence they're the same. Now what that does is bring you together, but of course it begins a process of exclusion. Who doesn't belong? Who is not part of our nation? And we see what that has meant in the 20th century. What it does in addition is begin to posit that you're a nation, you probably have a natural enemy. You probably have a nation on the other side of the border which in some way is your opposite. And so you get the French and the Germans, and it's an easy example to take because there was a great deal of writing in both France and Germany in this period about how the other is different. And so you get the French saying, the Germans are just not like us. They have no imagination. They're a dour, dull people. And the Prussians in particular, who the French had a particular dislike for, they said, have got something very wrong with them morally. They live in a very flat landscape, and they don't see hills and they don't see valleys. And so they have no capacity to distinguish between good and evil, which is, yeah, I know. Well, it's a very good example, if I may say. Never trust learned people who tell you things are so. I mean, these were theories being promoted by people with university posts. These were not crackpots, or they were crackpots, but they were people of very serious stature whose ideas were taken very seriously. And you got the same sort of thing happening in Germany. And this is, again, just take one example, the German professor who said, the French have never invented anything, and they're incapable of creativity or originality. They've never really been able to rule themselves. And he was. To be fair, he did get his critics who said, well, if you go to France, there are a great many beautiful cathedrals which the French seem to have built, and they were extremely good at making forts, and they did actually dominate Europe in the reign of Louis XIV, for example, or during Napoleon. How do you explain it? And he said, easy. And he said it's because the people in France who actually did those things were actually German. And he would spend his holidays on a bicycle and train going around France, looking at portraits of French notables, looking at statues of French notables, looking at tomb figures of French notables, picking out what he said were the Teutonic characteristics, the Teutonic nose, the Teutonic jaw. He said it's quite clear that it's the Teutonic blood in France which has really made these things happen in France. Now this we find absurd, but these were very powerful ideas. And what you had with this sort of nationalism, you had an increasing public participation in it. With the spread of mass communications and the spread of mass media campaigns, mostly newspapers were the main form of media in these days, you would get huge nationalist campaigns and nationalist feelings being worked up. nationalist lobbies in Germany and Britain. There were colonial lobbies, navy lobbies, arguing for more navies, for more colonies. Politicians and statesmen often found this a phenomenon which they didn't much like, which constrained them, but they felt they had to somehow respond to it, because increasingly, of course, they had to worry about the next election. They could no longer afford to disregard public opinion. And so there was a very unedifying quarrel between Britain and Germany over the Solomon Islands in the 1890s, where German public opinion got absolutely obsessed with the idea that it must have a bit of one of these islands down in the South Pacific. And as one German, very critical German, said of his own countrymen, he said, they're demanding a bit of the Solomon Islands. If you asked any person on the street where the Solomon Islands are, they couldn't tell you. They just know that it has become very important to Germany. And so you have this, which tends to mean that every crisis has the potential to become something where the public get engaged, where statesmen making decisions feel that they're under pressure, where they're reluctant to disappoint the fervor of their own publics, because it will count against them then and, of course, in the next election. What I think is also feeding into this is a set of ideas which are taken from Darwin, known as social Darwinism, which misapply Darwinian theories to human societies and argue, and it fits in very neatly in many ways with nationalism, which argue that you can identify separate species within the human race. So there is a German species, a French species. There's not a British species so much as an English species and an Irish species and a Scottish species, or an Italian species. And the idea that somehow that these are separable peoples, that you can distinguish them clearly one from the other. And what becomes a dangerous part of this is the idea that just as species, animals say in the natural world, have natural predators and have to struggle to survive, so do species. And so that every human species has a natural or hereditary enemy. This becomes sort of commonplace language. I mean, how many people actually read Darwin is another matter, and how many people actually read Herbert Spencer, who transmutes many of these ideas into dealing with human societies, is another matter, but they become part of the general vocabulary. What also becomes part of the general vocabulary is that somehow struggle is good, that in fact a nation that doesn't struggle to survive really doesn't deserve to survive. There's an immoral compulsion here that you ought to struggle, that you ought to be prepared to struggle. And I've seen the unpublished diaries of a young English lieutenant in the First World War, whose diaries were written partly for his family. He sent them home to them. And he describes, as you would imagine, conditions in the trenches, how awful they were. He said, things are pretty grim out here. A lot of people are dying. But he said, what can we do? That's the law of nature. You have to struggle to survive. And that seems to me an example of just how such concepts can permeate thinking and make war seem something that is natural, something that in fact is a moral obligation. And so we have a Europe which I think is very much a Europe in play, with those who think that peace is something which they want and which they think is the natural state of affairs, which is the sensible state of affairs. And then you have those who, for various reasons, have come accustomed, or perhaps never given up on the idea that war, in fact, is a natural part of human society, that war is something that we ought to do, that war is something that we shouldn't shrink from. You even get people, usually, if I may be unkind, men who are well beyond military age, saying a good war is good for society. We need a good, healthy bloodletting every so often. I mean, they're safely sitting in their university offices, so they're not preparing to sacrifice their own blood. But I think you do get too many people thinking that war is something that actually is good for society. What you also get by 1914 is a sense that we've been living with a series of crises. We've got an arms race. We've got these alliances which seem to be dividing up Europe. Maybe war would be like having a thunderstorm. Let's just get it over with. And it's an image which you see again and again in the literature of the time, that we're waiting for something to happen. There's a sense that something awful might happen. Wouldn't it be better just to get it over with? And of course, if you're assuming that a war is going to be like the other wars that you've seen more recently, 6 weeks, not that much longer, making some sort of decision, peace afterwards, you might actually say, as people did, let's just get it over with. Let's have a war. Let's not wait in this situation of tension. Things will look better later. And I think that helps to make the catastrophe in the summer of 1914. The assumption is that if a war is going to come, it's not going to last for very long. The warnings of Yves van Bloch and others, Jean Jaurès also worried about this and warned about this. Those warnings are discounted. They're discounted by the military experts, and I think they're discounted by a lot of society. What the military are promising are victories. Their plans, all of the European military plans of all the major powers, are offensive. What they're saying to their governments is, we're going to march into the enemy territory, we're going to surround the enemy armies, destroy them, they'll surrender, and then we'll make peace. They are not planning for a defensive war. And nor, I think, are they capable of saying to their own governments, we may not be able to guarantee you victory. That's not what the military do. The military say, we will give you victory and the war will be short. And so, when the crisis comes in the summer of 1914, those are the sorts of assumptions which they're working on. And I think the final thing that contributes to the crisis in the summer of 1914 really are two things. First of all, the timing. There have been a series of previous crises. On each occasion, there has been talk of a general war, but it hasn't happened. And so people assume, too many people, even those in positions of power in 1914, assume that this crisis that starts with the assassination of the Archduke in Sarajevo on the 28th of June 1914 will be like the one in 1913, like the one in 1912, like the one in 1911, like the one in 1908. There'll be a lot of talk about a general war, there'll be some partial mobilization, there'll be some threatening noises, and then they'll all sit down around a table somewhere and talk, and the war crisis will be over. And I think that was part of the complacency with which the assassination was greeted immediately. But the second thing that has happened as a result of those crises is that certain people in certain countries have said, this time we're not backing down, because people draw their own lessons from the crises. And so what you had in St. Petersburg, for example, was people around the Tsar. The Tsar himself was a weak man, but I think he shared this view, saying, we cannot back down anymore. We didn't back Serbia last time when Austria-Hungary threatened it. We can't afford not to do it again. Where would we be as a great power? Where would our honor be if we didn't back Serbia? This time we're not backing down, even if it means we go to war with Austria-Hungary and possibly Germany. And in Austria-Hungary, you get very much the same thing, that we have taken too much from Serbia. Austria-Hungary sees Serbia, this much smaller power down in the Balkans, as a menace to its very existence. What the Serbs are doing, or Serbian nationalists are doing, are calling on South Slavs to join in one larger South Slav entity, which would mean the South Slavs within Austria-Hungary would potentially leave, which would mean probably the end of Austria-Hungary. If the southern part of Austria-Hungary peeled away, not much would be left, and the other nationalities within Austria-Hungary would probably want to leave as well. And so for Austria-Hungary, Serbia wasn't just a tiresome little neighbor, it was a threat to its very existence. And when the assassination happened in Sarajevo, Austria-Hungary had the opportunity it had been waiting for. What more better excuse than the death of the heir to your throne, when you can prove, a small detail which they never managed to do, but when you think you can prove that the Serbian government was behind it. The chief of the Austrian General Staff, Konrad von Hötzendorf, heard about the assassination on a railway platform in Zagreb. He was on a train, they'd stopped, someone came with the news that the assassination had taken place, and his first thought, it was usually his first thought, but his first thought yet again was, we can have a war now. And this time he was going to get it. And so the crisis is, I think, compounded by the previous series of crises. And then in the end, of course, you get, and I think it's almost like something narrowing down. You have this huge, vast, complicated European society, but in those 5 weeks between June 28th and August the 4th, 1914, when it becomes a general war, that huge European society is at the mercy of a very few people who now have to make the decisions. And so you narrow down your focus, I think, just to those few people, and they make, in my view, the wrong decisions. Austria-Hungary decides to destroy Serbia or bring it to heel. Germany decides to back Austria-Hungary, knowing that there's a risk that Russia will come in. Russia decides to back Serbia, knowing that that means it goes to war both against Austria-Hungary and Russia, and so the war becomes a general one. We still worry about it. We still try and understand it because, of course, its consequences were so huge. Europe has never recovered from that war. It changed the face of Europe forever. It destroyed empires. It introduced Bolshevism to the world with consequences which ripple through into the 21st century. It speeded up the disappearance of the great European empires and speeded up, of course, the rise of the United States to world power. And it helped, tragically, to create the conditions in which a Second World War became likely. I think it's possible to say and argue, and I would, that without the First World War, we would not have had the conditions that made the Second World War take place. And so that's why I think we still try and continue to understand it. And I think somewhere lurking in there is a fear that if we don't understand it, we might do something equally stupid again. Thank you.
remercie pour cette fresque remarquable qui combine admirablement des éléments propres au contexte du début du XXe siècle et des éléments qui restent d'actualité, à savoir ce face-à-face, ce corps à corps peut-être entre les forces de paix et les forces de guerre. C'est une discussion que nous pourrions avoir sur la situation présente, où nous pourrions identifier de la même façon ce qui tend à rendre difficile ou impossible une nouvelle guerre, et je parle de guerre à une échelle continentale ou intercontinentale, et ce qui la prépare souterrainement dans les esprits. Notre conférencière est prête à accueillir quelques questions, en anglais si possible, mais en français également. Qui veut prendre la parole? Madame, là-bas.
Thank you.
Could you identify yourself and ask questions and do not give comments, please?
My name is Kirsten Henke. You drew a number of parallels between the current our current political situation and the situation at the turn of the 20th century. Do you have any ideas about perhaps the seeds of things that you see now that might cause people to do something as stupid or as, I'm sorry, you close it, yeah, something equally as stupid as happened then?
You can just speak.
Okay.
No, you can speak.
Okay. Our capacity to do stupid things is huge, I think. I think that's a given. What worries me always is when you have disputes which engage nationalist feelings, because I think these can push governments in ways they may not want to go. Governments sometimes themselves, of course, encourage such things. And I'm thinking of the current tension in the South and East China Seas between China and its neighbors, and how this is becoming a nationalist cause in Japan, for example. I was recently in Japan, and I talked to some Japanese international relations experts who were very concerned about the ways in which they thought Prime Minister Abe was using and appealing to Japanese nationalism to mobilize opinion against China, and the Chinese government doing something rather similar with Chinese nationalism. And the trouble with those things is they can get out of control far too quickly. And I think perhaps even more than in 1914, we expect governments to respond quickly. If a government hasn't responded in 2 minutes, people start getting impatient. And so the temptation to do something stupid, should a Chinese, let's hope not, but should a Chinese and a Japanese naval vessel have a clash, or should there be some incident in the air, the danger then, I think, is that opinion on both sides gets inflamed and it becomes very difficult for governments to back down. I think the same thing with what's happening around the borders of Russia, particularly, of course, in Ukraine. The potential there for things to get out of control. On the plus side, I think we do have stronger and more international institutions. And we also, I think, have a very sensible recognition that any major war now would be so devastating that it would probably, its consequences would be much worse than either the First or the Second World Wars. But I'm not always confident about human nature. As someone once said, not me, but we have a couple of design flaws there. So. I think it's someone up there.
No.
I think.
Okay,
No.
sorry.
Yeah, it's behind.
My name is Vera Lalchevska, and I'm a PhD student here at the Graduate Institute. Thank you very much for this very interesting lecture, and I really thought the angle you had on the psychological preparation was very interesting. And I wanted to ask whether, if you're looking today at what's happening, we don't have a world war today, but we have many, many mini wars. And these mini wars across the world, the most recent one being last week in Macedonia, or maybe a hint of something happening, potentially, in the Balkans again. I was wondering what you thought about, and you mentioned the arms race during and in preparation for the First World War, and I was wondering what you think about the arms sale, and a lot of analysts talking about arms sale as being the interest and the reason for certain countries, and not countries where wars are happening, but countries that are selling arms. Could you speak to that today and the wars that are happening? And do you think that the promotion of the psychological need for war to promote democracy, when after these wars in certain areas like the Orange Revolution, the Maghreb, etc., after that we see that democracies are not really happening?
Well, both interesting questions. I'll try and answer them fairly briefly, if I may. Establishing democracy is a very complex business, and I think we've all made a big mistake in thinking democracy is just about having elections. And we've forgotten, I think, how long it took us in the West to establish our own democracies. You know, we didn't establish them in 2 years, 2 months. It took centuries. And it takes the growth of democratic institutions, democratic attitudes. These are not things that can be easily established. I think we also shouldn't give up too soon. I mean, I think something clearly has shifted in countries such as Egypt. We may not see a fully fledged democracy developing there right away, but I think there have been significant shifts. On the whole question of arms races and arms sales, I mean, I think arms races are potentially always destabilizing. And part of the destabilizing effect is that people are always afraid of being caught behind, because the problem with an arms race is whatever you've bought is going to be obsolete, or whatever you've developed is going to be obsolete in a given length of time. And so the temptation is, while you have the edge to fight before the other side can catch up. I mean, so I do think there's a destabilizing effect. One of the arguments, I don't know if you were referring to this, but one of the arguments made about the First World War later on was that it was all fomented by what were called the merchants of death, that the arms manufacturers really wanted a war. My own view is arms manufacturers don't want a war. What they want is a nice state of tension, because in a nice state of tension, they can sell to both sides. In a war, they can only sell to one side, and they often have to deal with government controls and government limits of their profits. I mean, Krupp's, the great arms manufacturer, both helped to build the fortifications at the Belgian forts before 1914 and created the guns that knocked those forts down. So that's, from an arms manufacturer's point of view, the ideal situation. So.
I'm Ingrid Vetter. I'm a professor of international law, and I write about the law of war, also at Oxford. And I was just wondering if one should add in the causes of war or the development of war, a very important issue of the media, because as someone once said, or perhaps it was I, that peace is pretty boring, but war makes rattling good reading.
Well, this is an old debate. I mean, did William Randolph Hearst create the Spanish-American War? It's often said that he helped to create the atmosphere. I think such views tend to come from the press themselves, who like to think about how very powerful they are. I mean, Rupert Murdoch is always taking credit for whichever government gets elected in the UK. I do think that the media can pick up and reflect, and in some cases encourage particular views, but they're responsive. I mean, I'm thinking before the First World War, where the media were largely mass circulation newspapers and magazines, they were picking up on something that already existed. I mean, I don't believe it's just one way. I don't think the public is an inert lump of dough which is moved this way and that way by the media. I think the media are trying to sell newspapers, and so they're trying to find things that will appeal to their publics. Now, they will push certain things, and you're right. I mean, war scares were good for business. There was a very famous book called, I can't remember what it was, about a putative invasion of Britain, which came out in 1907. It was serialized. No, it wasn't Riddle of the Sands, thank you, but it was something, it was earlier. The Invasion of 1910, thank you. But the Riddle of the Sands is very much, but I was thinking of the Invasion of 1910 because it was, the Northcliffe Press serialized it, and the invasion route was going to come through a certain part of southern England, and Northcliffe said, could you please change it because I'll sell more newspapers if you move it slightly over. So, I think it's a complex relationship, and I do think the media can play a part, and they certainly can magnify nationalist fervor, which they did before 1914, clearly. So.
My name is Abba Kalindi, and I'm a student at the International School of Geneva. Thank you very much for your lecture. There's a very strong argument that the alliance system at the time of 1914 played a significant role in causing the First World War, but you mentioned that the alliances were very loose at the time, and you gave the example of Italy. And my question was, if, as you say, alliances are so easy to break, and if, for example, the dual alliance between Germany and Austria-Hungary had broken, would there have been a war nonetheless, or would the circumstances have continued, and would there have been a war anyway? Thank you.
Yeah, no, it's a very good and interesting question. The answer is I don't know. I think, countries hesitate to get out of alliances because of reputational damage and because they may not find another alliance partner. The German attitude was very well expressed by von Jagow, who was the foreign secretary, who said, why we ever allied ourselves to that, decaying hulk on the Danube, I don't know. But what can we do? Where else can we go? We don't have anyone else. And so I think the danger I see in the alliance system is not so much that it leads people into war like a chain reaction, but that it encourages sometimes behavior which isn't likely to lead to stability. What I mean, for example, is that in alliance systems, one of the fears is losing your partner. And the French will become very, very worried about losing Russia, for example. As Russia became, Russia is in many ways the great development success story of the period before 1914. It's got a huge rate of growth. It's developing modern industries. Population is becoming more literate, so on. And I think what the French were very worried about was that as Russia became more powerful and as Russian industry grew, it would no longer need French technology and no longer need French investment. And so the French are worried about losing Russia, which for them is a dreadful loss because Russian manpower compensates for the demographic gap between France and Germany. And so it is possible, and some have argued this, that the French encourage the Russians to be more belligerent and encourage them to be more anti-German as a way of trying to hang on to Russia. And so I think sometimes what you get in alliance systems is the fear of losing the partner, encouraging you to do things which aren't rational. The other thing I think with alliance systems is when great powers have small states that they are protecting, those small states can sometimes get away with a lot because the small state like Serbia knows that Russia probably has to protect it because otherwise Russia will look idiotic and like it can't protect even a small state like Serbia. And so it encourages a recklessness on the part of the smaller states and means that the bigger state ends up supporting behavior it doesn't necessarily approve of. I think a very parallel example today is the United States and Israel. The United States finds itself supporting Israel even when it disapproves of its policies because the alternative would be to damage American prestige. But that in turn may encourage Israel to take steps in the knowledge that the United States will protect it. Or North Korea and China, same sort of thing.
Thank you very much. My name is Samuel Segura. I'm a PhD student also here at the Graduate Institute. And I was wondering, I was very stimulated from what you previously said about the merchants of death and so on, and these kind of issues and this state of perfect tension. And then I was thinking, and now that you spoke about small states, I was thinking also about what about those small neutral states and the role that they played during World War, because quite often the narratives about World War I involved also a lot of great power talk. And these small neutral states are kind of diluted, except perhaps of Belgium, because everyone discusses about the horrible crimes that the Germans did to Belgium. But what about, for instance, places like Scandinavia, Denmark? I would like to pick your brains on whether you have any particular insight as to the role of these countries in the war.
Well, you can be neutral depending on where you are. Belgium couldn't be neutral because it was on the German invasion route into France. The Netherlands could remain neutral because Germany had decided, for a number of reasons, not to invade the Netherlands on the way to France. And so neutrality, I think, is very much determined by geography. It also helps, as in the case of Switzerland, if you have both a geography and a determination to fight, to defend it. Is it worth the cost to a larger power of trying to take it over? but states that are in the wrong place find that neutrality is almost impossible to maintain. But I do think neutrality is a very important concept in international relations and in international law, and it was one of the things that the British felt very strongly about. I think their thinking in 1914 was partly tempered by concern for what was happening to Belgium, but there was a more general concern about what would happen when big powers felt they could violate the neutrality of any country. And Britain had at various stages in its history chosen to be neutral. And so the principle was very important for the British of neutrality. So I do think, the trouble is you can say as much as you like about neutrality, but in certain circumstances there's not much you can do about it. So.
Hello, my name is Phi Huynh. I'm a professional in Geneva. Thank you very much for a very interesting conference and subject. And I would like to return to what you have said about a revival of nationalism in many countries, in many world powers, like China and Russia. And which lesson could we draw from the events leading to the First World War to avoid a generalized conflict now?
Yeah.
Because the situation in Ukraine is quite alarming, and the situation in the South China Sea is quite alarming too. And in China, we don't have a democracy. So do you think that, for example, diplomats could have done more, that international law could be used to avoid a conflict? For example, in the South China Sea, the International Tribunal of the Sea, the UNCLOS agreement, and in the conflict in Ukraine, the Europeans are very much involved. What can the European community do to avoid a conflict, for example?
Well, if I knew that, yes. I know it's a very good question, but it's very, very difficult to answer. I mean, I think, international law is, we sometimes make, I think, mistakenly the analogy between international law and law in a particular country. And the difference is the enforcement mechanism. And so far in international law, we have only got the beginnings of a way of enforcing it. I mean, inside a country, when a law is broken, there are means of dealing with that and means of enforcing a sanction or a penalty on those who break the law. And we're only beginning, I think, to establish that in international law. And so it's very difficult to see international law as a way of trying to keep the peace. Diplomacy, I think, is important, and what worries me is the ways in which foreign ministries seem to be, at least in my own country, moving away from regional expertise to subject expertise, which is needed. You need people who understand about arms negotiations and disarmament negotiations or international trade negotiations, but you also need people who understand areas very well. And that's also happening at universities. I think area studies, regional studies, where people get to know the part of a world extremely well, is declining. And it's happening with the news media, mostly for economic reasons. And we no longer have the bureaus abroad that the media used to have, where you have people who lived in a country and really got to understand that country. And the less we understand of each other, the more likely we are to draw false pictures of what the other is doing. We tend to see things through our own eyes always. But if we don't understand what the ways of thinking of the other side or the others we're dealing with is, then we tend to project onto them our own sort of fears and concerns, and we might interpret what they do in very bad ways. So this is not a very satisfactory answer, but I think clearly negotiation, diplomacy, attempts to build bridges, attempts to reassure are very, very important. I don't know how we should have dealt with Putin. I'm not sure he is an easy person to deal with. How do you deal with someone like that? But perhaps we could have dealt with Russia generally in a more effective way since the end of the Cold War. I mean, I think it's too late now to do anything about it, but I think the West treated Russia with a sort of contempt as if it was finished, which was a mistake with a country that big, with such a strong sense of itself, with such a big population, and with such great resources. So I'm not answering your question, I think, because it's very, very difficult to know how we can keep the world on an even keel. But I do think that the more we know about each other, the more links there are, the more understanding there is, and the more negotiation there is at all sorts of levels, at least we have some hope of averting catastrophe.
Professor Niva.
I'm Georges Niva. I have a question about the fragility of intelligentsias. Last year there was an exhibition at St. Petersburg, very astonishing, avant-garde, Russian avant-garde, and the outburst of the war. And we could see astonishing caricatures of the Germans, of the German Imperator by Malevich, poetry and drawings by Mayakovsky. And this was hidden before, of course, during the Soviet regime. So we had an idea, but not a very neat idea of what it was like. The outburst of nationalism, first week of the war, among people who were members of the futurist, extreme avant-garde intelligentsia, and who under the pressure of some kind of pressure of nationalism seemed to betray themselves. And you couldn't find out who they were before and who they were after that. This leads me to think about the fragility of intelligentsias before the idea of war at that time and today.
Yeah. It's a very good point and a rather discouraging one, actually, because you tend to think, perhaps wrongly, we tend to think the intelligentsia will think rationally and use their minds and use the powers of reasoning. But I think, you know, what surprised everyone in Europe, and that's what really destroyed the Second International, was the great power of nationalism. That people who hadn't thought they would behave like this were swept along with it. I've just been reading the diaries of Count Harry Kessler, who's this extraordinary figure who kept a diary for over 50 years, and he quite, it's not quite literally, because that would be telling a lie, but he seems to have known almost everyone in the avant-garde in Europe who mattered, plus all sorts of political figures. I mean, I opened his diary at random the other day, and he had tea with Vuillard and Bonnard and had dinner with Renoir. And he was at the first night of the Rites of Spring in 1913 and ended up in a taxi with Diaghilev and Nijinsky going for a drink. I mean, he just knew everyone. But when the war started, and he was an internationalist, he was cosmopolitan, the war started, he became a Prussian. And he was talking about, you know, we have to really mailed fist with these Belgians, how dare they oppose us. Here is this man who had loved beauty all his life, who was in the avant-garde, had supported all sorts of artists, suddenly turns into this Prussian militarist. Now, eventually he calms down, but it takes him 4 years. So I don't know what it is. I mean, I think nationalism is a tremendously powerful force. I think there was also a sense among certainly those on the left, those who had been at odds with their own societies in some ways, that suddenly what had been a tension was gone. There's a German socialist I was reading who said, when the war broke out, suddenly he said, I felt so wonderful because the tension between being a socialist and being a German had disappeared. You know, it no longer mattered. It was dissolved in being part of the people. And you had the same thing with people like Richard Strauss, you know, people who you wouldn't have expected to behave like this. And so I do think there is this sort of emotion. I do also think, and Isaac Babel has really, I think, been very good on this, there is a fascination that a lot of intellectuals and the intelligentsia have with people who aren't like them, people who are very decisive. I mean, Babel wrote those amazing stories about riding with the Cossacks, and this admiration he had for these people who don't reflect, who don't do all the sort of things that the intelligentsia do, who just act. And I do think there's a tendency for intellectuals to be drawn along by that. I'm not sure it's an answer, but it is a fascinating phenomenon. I think you're absolutely right.
Nous devons terminer. Il y avait encore une question. La dernière.
Journalism student in IE Madrid. You made many similitudes between our society today and the one before. And you also talked about the rise of nationalism. Well, we're living that right now with the extreme right raising up in France, in Italy, in Spain, pretty much everywhere around Europe. Then you also talked about the light alliances that were created. As we can see with the European Union, our alliance is quite light as well nowadays. So my question is, how has our society evolved, and what characteristics are we lacking for the creation of a third World War?
Oh, I hope not too many. I think Europe has moved a long way between seeing war as something that settles anything. Not that there haven't been wars, but I think they have been generally deplored. I think the wars in the Balkans in the 1990s were generally deplored by European society, and what's been happening in Ukraine, I think, has been generally deplored. I don't think you get the same sort of acceptance as war as a natural part of human affairs or as something desirable that you had before 1914. I mean, I do think societies can change. I mean, I think, I always think of Sweden. In the 18th century, you would not have wanted to be anywhere that the Swedes were coming. They were a belligerent, thuggish power, causing a great deal of trouble. Look at them now. Sweden is one of the most peaceful countries in the world. So I think countries do evolve and do change, and societies change. And I think Europe has moved a long way. What I think, of course, is worrying is that one of the great glues of the European Union was the memory of the First and Second World Wars. I mean, those who founded first the community and then the Union were those who had lived through, in many cases, both wars, and were determined that this should not happen again. And of course, time has gone by, and that memory has now faded because it's no longer in people's minds. Those people have disappeared from the scene. And so the very reason why a European community was needed is, I think, no longer as alive as it was in 1945, 1946, throughout the 50s and 60s. And that, I think, is a problem that Europe has to face. As far as the growth of the right-wing anti-immigrant parties, I think they in some way reflect, or not reflect, but you can find parallels. I mean, the parallels are never exact, but you can find parallels before 1914 in the right-wing anti-Semitic parties that you got, say, in Vienna. Partly, I think it's a reaction to globalization and a sense that the world is changing too quickly, and people are clinging to smaller communities, and they're trying to blame someone. And who do you blame? You blame those who are close at hand, who don't talk the same language as you do, who eat different sorts of food, or listen to different sorts of music. Globalization, as we, I think, are increasingly realizing, is very mixed in its consequences, and not everyone benefits. And I think, we've had this sort of story about globalization, that it's all wonderful and it's making the world, everyone's more prosperous and we're all happier and everyone's linked together. Well, we're now realizing that it's not quite as simple as that. So I think part of what we're seeing is a reaction to globalization, or certain aspects of globalization.
Merci. J'aimerais faire deux choses, si vous me permettez. La première, c'est de vous inviter à remercier avec moi notre conférencière qui nous a offert une magnifique fin d'après-midi. Et la seconde, puisque c'est la clôture du festival, j'aimerais donner la parole à Pierre Souiri, qui a été la cheville ouvrière, le pilier, la poutre maîtresse, un peu tout, de ce festival. Pierre.
Rassurez-vous, je ne serai pas long. D'abord, je voudrais commencer par remercier la professeure Macmillan qui a accepté de faire cette conférence de clôture à l'issue de ce festival qui a duré 3 jours, qui a commencé par une conférence du juge Guzman qui nous a expliqué les difficultés de la justice transitionnelle vers la démocratie après la dictature chilienne, et cette conférence de clôture donc magnifique qui a réussi, vous avez réussi à englober toute une série de facteurs dont les facteurs psychologiques ne sont pas les moins importants et n'ont pas toujours été étudiés, à mon avis, autant qu'ils le devraient. Je voulais aussi remercier, bien sûr, Philippe Burin et toute l'équipe du Graduate Institute of Geneva pour nous avoir offert cet après-midi donc de table ronde et de conférences, et d'avoir donc co-organisé avec l'Université de Genève ce festival consacré cette année, en tout cas, à la construction de la paix. J'espère que d'autres éditions auront lieu et je vous souhaite une très bonne fin de journée. Merci à tous.